before we get started, we're going to begin our session with a quick video that'll help orient the discussion. Oh, no. Keep it going? Okay. So, I don't like to hide things. So when things go wrong, you all will know, because you all are my family now. So why don't we just go ahead and jump into the discussion. So my name is LaTese Briggs. I'm your moderator for this afternoon. I'm the director for the Center for Strategic Philanthropy. In a couple minutes, we may watch a video about that. We may not. But these women who surround me are my superchargers. They are absolutely awesome.
If the video doesn't work, I can do a commercial.
Word. Yes, please. So I'm going to go through and give you a quick introduction of each one of them. So on the far right, we have Debra Black, who is the co-founder of the Melanoma Research Alliance, which is the largest private funder of melanoma, having funded $80 million since its inception in 2007. Debra is also a Broadway producer. She's won a Tony for The History Boys as well as The Pillow Man. Then we have Cindy Citrone, who is the founder and CEO of the 33 Foundation. The foundation invests in an array of programs from education to health and human services. And Cindy's foundation, along with Cindy herself, really takes a sort of a design thinking approach or a user-centric approach in making her investment in communities by really going out there and asking them what it is that they need. So doing that deeper dive in terms of the examination. Cindy's also on the board of the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, Giant Step School for Autism, as well as Elon University. Joyce Keller, to my left, is the philanthropic director of the Gilbert Family, the Gilbert Family Foundation. She serves as the philanthropic advisor to Jennifer and Dan Gilbert. Dan Gilbert is the chairman and founder of Quicken Loans and the majority owner of the 2016 NBA champions, Cleveland Cavaliers. Go LeBron. Previously, Joyce was the executive director of JARC. Did I say that right? Perfect. Which is a nonprofit organization serving people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in Oakland County, Michigan. She was appointed to President Bill Clinton's committee to serve for the Presidential Committee on Intellectual Disabilities, and by the Michigan Governor John Engler to serve on the Community Health Advisory Council. So she's just out here. On all the committees. And then finally, last but not least, Melissa Stevens, the executive director of the Center for Strategic Philanthropy. Just to give you a little bit of background on the center. So her center works to maximize return on philanthropic investment by ensuring that best practices are implemented into giving strategies and the innovations used to address one social issue is translated to another. So previously, Stevens was the deputy director of Faster Cures, which is another center here at the Milken Institute. And prior to that, she worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers. So thank you all for joining us today and joining the Supercharger movement, or at least hopefully at the end of this panel, you will join the Supercharger movement. So before we get started and I start asking these lovely women questions about their journeys, I just want to set the stage real quick. So, you know, right now in medical research and science, we live in a time where federal funding for science and medical research are stagnant and have been for a really long time. This has led to slow research project progress, leaky human capital pipelines of PhD and master level scientists that are leaving the system. And I'll be the first to admit, just so that you don't read it in the press, that I'm one of these scientists that left the system. And, you know, finally, and most importantly, this has led to good ideas being left on the shelf because researchers can't find the funding to support them. So that's all bad news, at least to me it is. But the good news is that philanthropy can really make a difference in addressing these issues. And while it makes up less than 5% of the total amount of money that goes into medical research, it can really have an outsized impact because it can be nimble, it can take on more risk than traditional funding sources. So getting back to my superchargers on the panel, we're going to talk about these game-changing women about their role in philanthropy and how they've worked to catalyze solutions for change in this ecosystem. So starting with Cindy and Debra, you both were thrust into the world of medical philanthropy through very personal experiences in your lives. Debra, you were diagnosed with melanoma, and Cindy, you were diagnosed with breast cancer. Can you each share a little bit about what that journey was like as a patient, as a survivor, What were your goals when you set out? Well, what was your mindset? Because I'm sure there was a lot going on. And what were your goals when you set out, and how those goals change over time? So, Deborah, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you. So where do you begin? I was diagnosed with stage 2 melanoma, I guess almost 10 years ago in May, because you always remember exactly when it happened. And I was kind of shocked because my husband was on the board of our hospital, and I went regularly to a dermatologist, and unfortunately I was misdiagnosed, like many people with melanoma are. And luckily for me, Mike Milken is a very close friend of our families. And unbeknownst to me, his dad had passed from melanoma 40 years prior to my diagnosis. And what was so shocking was how little had been accomplished in the 40 years since his father's death and my own diagnosis. And Mike, being Mike, and I think a lot of people in this audience know him, he basically said, well, do you want to do for melanoma what we've done with prostate cancer? And we're like, well, yes, but what do we know about running a disease-specific foundation? And luckily, Michael was able to really fast forward the research. And when I say the research, reaching out to all the scientists. So we had our first call to action really 10 years ago in November. And I say this because I think it's so important when you're diagnosed to have somebody to guide you, because you're in shock. You hear the word cancer. You, in my case, have children, and you just think, oh my God, am I going to live to see my children grow up? And for me, that was an incredibly powerful, I was willing to do anything to get better and to, but what I also realized is I am lucky. I've had access, what I thought was to great medical care. And if it could happen to me that I was misdiagnosed and facing a serious health issue, very serious health issue, it could happen to anyone. And so we didn't want to stay with the same, just like, how do you change it? And we decided we would fast forward the research, and with Michael's help and my husband Leon's help, and he's very nice to be in the audience today, we decided to aggressively fund melanoma research. And in the last 10 years, I'm proud to say we funded 88 million, not 8.
My
80,
apologies.
yeah.
That's a
No. We're
significant
very proud of
difference.
it. And we've also been able to leverage many other sources, so over $150 million in research for melanoma has happened. And then I'll stop with the fact that we funded the last 11 approved therapies, and these therapies are used now today for many diseases, be it breast cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer, bladder cancer. So many diseases should be working together to fast forward the research, because there's so much to be learned from many diseases.
So true. My journey was a little different. I wasn't shocked with my diagnosis. My mother and my grandmother both had breast cancer, and my mother had passed away from it. So I always sort of thought I had a 50-50 shot of getting it. In doing that, my husband and I in our foundation, we started to invest early in things that we thought, established relationships out there. We didn't have the benefit of knowing Mike, and we tried to dive into a few hospital studies, which ended miserably bad. So about a year before my diagnosis, we went to the next step of just sort of writing the checks and praying, and decided that we were going to get educated on this. So we did a lot of the research. We spoke to survivors, we did speak to people. We really took a look at who was doing what out there in a very overcrowded space. As many know, there definitely needs to be some mergers and acquisitions and more collaboration in the breast cancer field. So after spending a lot of time with this, we did sort of land with the research component at the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, and I joined their board. That reason being is they fund people. That's a big philosophy of ours, find a good person and run with it. They fund over 250 institutions, grants, every major breakthrough that has been done in the breast cancer world, whether it be a drug, a study, or testing has gone through them for the past 25 years. And 25 years ago, when Evelyn Lauder started it, it was revolutionary. There is no rainy day fund for Breast Cancer Research Foundation. We spend every dollar that we raise every year because, as Evelyn used to believe, as long as people are still sick, there's no need to be holding an endowment. So that was incredibly exciting. And then about my first year on the board, I was diagnosed. And all of a sudden, it became even more personal. My grandmother was diagnosed at 70. My mother passed at 60. I was 50. I started to get concerned about my 2 daughters. And I'm like, we need to accelerate this cure. The BCRF is doing phenomenal things. So then we came to them as philanthropists and foundations. And it was also with their medical director who said, listen, this is just as frustrating to us. We've just told you we have seen every major breakthrough. I see research from 250 doctors for the past 25 years, and we can't get this from, the laboratory to bedside. And we think we can do a better job at doing it. So what we're very excited to be launching with BCRF, and in May we actually have our first board vote, which I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to be sharing this news formally, is that we want to because we've spent a lot of time looking into it and getting a lot of consultants, and then we did get the Center for Strategic Philanthropy and Mike involved. Under the nonprofit standard, we want to develop a venture fund. We want to raise capital to support what our doctors, our 250 researchers, have identified as the 10 to 12 most promising projects as well as most profitable. We want to make our research sustainable. I don't ever want to buy another table at a benefit again, and so this is where we really see the future and moving forward while continuing our traditional model. So we're really excited to be launching into phase 2 of that.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Deborah. So, Melissa, in your work with philanthropists and foundations, you meet a lot of people with stories similar to Deborah and Cindy. And you and I, we talk a lot about passive philanthropy, thankful philanthropy, and then active/venture philanthropy. Can you talk more about what those things are and sort of what you're seeing in terms of the trend is in terms of level of engagement by philanthropists along that continuum?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. In our world, we often say that you don't go to medical philanthropy unless you're Cindy. You did. Medical philanthropy often comes to you, and you can become a medical philanthropist overnight when you get that diagnosis. So a parent has Alzheimer's, a spouse has cancer, your child has a rare genetic disease, and all of a sudden you want to do everything that you can to develop new treatments for that person and every patient like that person. And so if you haven't spent the time understanding the space, understanding the system, it's really complicated. And so often some of the first places you would turn to are very logical, right? So first you may turn to the doctor that treated you, the hospital that treated you. And so we think about that as grateful patient or thankful philanthropy. Or there is an organization, a nonprofit that focuses on this disease. They approach you. You can write a check and assume that they're taking care of the problem. And that's sort of checkbook philanthropy. But I think with both of those, there's an underlying assumption that financing is actually the problem, and that's not the only problem in medical research. Yes, we do need more capital into the system, but we need to deploy it in different sorts of ways to really tackle some of the key issues. And so I think there is there's an appreciation for that now, that there is an entire system we need to look at when we're trying to develop new therapies. And so there's a pivot from this checkbook philanthropy or thankful, grateful patient philanthropy to strategic philanthropy. And that philanthropists they're having a point of view about what they want to solve, about what that problem is about. And so through that process, if they want to solve a problem, move from supporters to problem solvers, they need to be intimately familiar with what that problem is. And so they're spending time to do that. So they are understanding what are the scientific unknowns, what are the gaps in human capital, what are the gaps in the tools and infrastructure. And then they need to know who are the stakeholders, who are all the other nonprofits that are working in my space, what does government think about this, what the heck do biotech and pharma need to see, what are the regulators saying about this, and really understanding all the roles of the stakeholders, the incentives of the stakeholders, who's taking on what. And then the final prism to look through is what's the role of philanthropy? Because philanthropy is a really unique asset. and it can be patient capital. It's not beholden to election cycles. It's not beholden to earning cycles. It can take on a lot of risk that other people just aren't willing to take, and it can start to change the culture of science. And so when we start to understand what the problem really is, the root cause really is, what are the entry points for philanthropy, who are the other stakeholders, you start to get a good idea as to where can my capital have the highest ROI. And I think that's what's really exciting, is that we're seeing that shift to strategic philanthropy, and I think under that model, we're just going to see better and better dividends.
Can I tell my favorite ROI story? Antonio Brown does a softball tournament, and in his sponsorship package, he promised a post-event ROI report. So when athletes and such are paying attention to ROI, I think it's out there.
Yeah. That's great.
So Joyce, you manage the portfolio for Dan and Jen Gilbert. Dan is a pretty focused guy, right? Can you talk a little about more? Can you tell us what his interests are and why? Because he's, from what I understand, he's been funding in neurofibromatosis for a long time. Can you tell us more about NF and sort of how long he's been in the space and his shift in direction?
Well, yes. First of all, I want to say I'm very honored to be on this panel because we're sort of have training wheels on compared to where the two of you have been for many years, strategically at least. So Dan and Jennifer are very focused on neurofibromatosis. It's a genetic nerve disorder that causes tumors to grow on nerves anywhere in the body. So there's no poster child for NF. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of manifestations of it. It's a really tough disorder. Their oldest son was born with NF, and so they, of course, as it gets foisted upon you, they became very focused on this area. Dan joined the board of the Children's Tumor Foundation, which is the national organization, many, many years ago, and did preclinical funding there, a variety of things. He also established 2 clinics, one in Israel and one in Washington, D.C., where his son is treated. We also fund a researcher a geneticist. So Dan's done various kinds of funding over time. And a few years ago, he said to me, we really have to bring a scientist on the team. I mean, neither Dan or Jennifer are scientists. I'm certainly not a scientist. I got involved with the Gilberts, not having to do with NF, but having to do with the rest of their philanthropy. And so as I started to sort of feel that out, I realized trying to pick a winner, trying to pick the right person to be on the team who can answer all the questions, vet all the zillions of pitches that we get and so on, didn't seem to make sense. And so in my pursuit, I stumbled upon, not really stumbled, but I dug deeper into, at the time it was called the Philanthropy Advisory Services, but it's a Center for Strategic Philanthropy. And I realized that was a better answer for us, because what Dan really wanted to do in his sort of funding 2.0, he wanted to have a deeper impact, deeper rather than broader. A lot of what we had been funding up till that point was very important, but it was focused on treatments, which is, again, extremely important. But there were 2 areas that Dan was particularly interested in. One was in vision restoration, which was inspired by his son's own loss of vision from his NF, which caused his tumors were on his optic nerve, and he's lost most of his sight in one eye, and all of his sight in one eye, and almost all of it in the second eye. So that was sort of one of those downstream things. It was beyond the treatment stage. It was what happens when the damage is already there. And the other area that has particular interest for him is very much upstream, which is how do we tackle the disease before all these manifestations appear. So because it's a genetic disease and it's a mutated gene in every cell in the body, that's a pretty audacious goal to try to figure out how to do that. But so in gene therapy, the focus on gene therapy is hoping to either figure out a way to replace the gene, repair the gene, or more likely to trick the gene into thinking that it's normal. This is going on in other diseases, and so Dan's focus and our focus is on our interest is on looking to see how that can be applied to NF. So in working, we've had a long relationship already with the Center for Strategic Philanthropy. It's been quite a roller coaster. But we really, our interest in seeking them out was because we knew a lot of the key opinion leaders in the NF field, but we certainly didn't know, we weren't familiar enough with the broader research community, and there's much to be learned outside your immediate disease area. There's much to be learned by attendant fields and other fields that have been there, done that, learned a lot, and can share it. So that, for us, was the magic of it, was being able to have that reach, that depth of the bench that you bring to the table. So we are, Dan, the Gilberts have just decided on their first initiative, which is I think it's very large, maybe not compared to others, but it's a good-sized consortium of vision researchers, none of whom were working on NF. They were working mostly in glaucoma and retinitis pigmentosa, which are the two, I guess, leading causes of blindness in this country. And right before we sort of settled on this, our timing was great because about a year ago, there was a great breakthrough in vision research having to do with the creation of retinal ganglion cells, which doesn't matter if you know what they are, but they're sort of the basis of what forms the optic nerve. And they were able to be created outside the body for the first time, and that was an enormous breakthrough. So coming along as we are at this point, and I think this is the value of medical philanthropy, that's very focused. And I guess that's the key to me, is Dan is extremely focused on these more narrow areas. We think we can bridge a big gap and hopefully make a big leap in this area, because it would be very exciting. So we know it's an audacious goal, but we're very excited about it. And we haven't quite made the decision on the gene therapy yet, but I'm pretty confident we're going to move forward with that as well. So Dan is not a focused person, as some of his cohorts would say, but in this kind of way, in the interest of trying to make a big impact, rather than, as we say, millions to the zillions, the idea of being very focused and seeing if going deeper can produce different results.
Thank you, Joyce. So we were supposed to have another panelist, and he wasn't able to join us at the last minute. George Pavlov, who works on behalf of Sergey Brin, they've given in the Sergey Brin Family Foundation, and they've been given in Parkinson's for a while. And so I wanted to kind of highlight this story because we heard about the on-ramps from the patient perspective, and then kind of these stories around being in the space for a while and feeling like I need to change direction. And George and Sergey are very much in that position. And so they've been working with Melissa to figure out what's that strategic change that they need to make. So Melissa, can you give some insight as to how they are changing direction?
Yeah, sure. And just as a quick background, again, it's personal for Sergey as well. His mother has Parkinson's. He himself has been public that he has the LRRK2 gene, which is a genetic sort of driver of Parkinson's, and so he has an increased probability of getting the disease. And so it's been giving actively in the space for quite some time now. And what their giving has been focused on a part of the research process called translational research. And so just to do a really quick 101, when we think about bringing a therapy to market, we have the basic science, which is the very, very early stage, and really just trying to crack the code on the biological underpinnings of the disease. So for example, finding that LRRK2 is actually sort of a genetic driver of the disease. Once we have those understandings, we need to translate that and into some sort of therapy that could be applied to humans, right? So then we need to have a molecule or an intervention, a therapy that could target a protein, a gene, et cetera. And then finally, clinical trials where we test the safety and efficacy of that in humans. And so they've been focused on the translational space for quite some time. And if we look sort of generally across the board, translational research is a really good place to be for philanthropy, because philanthropy can lean in when a lot of people are stepping back from the space. And so we think about sort of the government being able to fund a lot of the basic science, industry has clinical, but this translational gap in the middle, that used to be venture capital, but they're moving later and later stage as well because it's risky, it's not really sexy, and so there's been this dearth of capital, and so it's really been an opportunity for philanthropy to lean into that space. But what we found is that even with the translational research funding, we're not seeing great stuff in the clinic, or coming out of the clinic, and so there's been a bit of a reset to say, well, maybe we need to go further upstream. We need to really understand the science. What is really happening in this disease? What are all these different proteins actually doing? Are they actually drug targets? And so there's been a bit of a pivot to sort of expand and to think about basic science as well. And so what we're helping them to do is bring the entire Parkinson's community together and develop a Parkinson's disease research roadmap. And what that will do is to really identify and prioritize those threshold scientific questions and have buy-in from the community. And once we have that, then we can start to say, well, who's taking which pieces? Okay, what is the NIH funding? How can the nonprofits and philanthropy come together and address these issues and have ownership of them and understand, okay, it's not just the funding. What are the tools we need to build? What's the infrastructure that we need to build to actually facilitate the science? And if we invest in the basic science, then the theory goes, we're going to have better translational science, we're going to have better clinical science, and that's how we're going to get therapies to market for Parkinson's disease. So I think it's been, so I think it's a really exciting inflection point for them and for the field. And just, one more quick point on that. We talk a lot about, is it translational versus basic? And I think what we would say is it actually doesn't have to be one or the other, right? You need to think about where the science is, and from there understand, do you want to play in basic? Do you want to play in translational? Or you could play in both and have both in your portfolio.
Absolutely. So to kind of continue around the point of bringing folks together, bringing research, a community together, I want to talk a little bit more about the power of convening. And I want to highlight this because for all of you, your strategic approaches have by and large come from, bringing the researchers together. So Deborah, you mentioned the call to action that you guys put together before you erected the foundation. Can you talk a little bit more about why that was necessary and the types of people that you had to bring together and what came out of it?
Sure. So we had our first call to action 10 years ago to sort of with 60 researchers who primarily worked in other fields because melanoma up till that point had been pretty much of a career dead end. And what we discovered is how much people were working in silos, the researchers, even in the same institutions. And since then, every year we hold a retreat. So we fund about 8 to 10, sometimes $12 million a year. And when we do that, we put out a request for proposals. We have 36 leaders in the field, the who's who, state of the art, who are in pathology, dermatology, oncology, data, because you have all this great research, but you need people to interpret it as well. So we call them together, and one of the requirements, and again, this isn't our idea, we copied this from Milken's groups, that we won't fund you unless you come to the retreat and share your research. Because so much happens that doesn't work. And you don't want people to constantly do the same thing over and over again. That's not published in Nature or Nurture or Gene or any of these publications. So you want to know the things that don't work in addition to the things that do work. And at our retreat every year, everyone we fund has to come and report. And as a result, many people working in the field are there and learning from what has been successful, what hasn't, and challenging the presenters. Well, are you sure this works? Have you tried this? Have you tried that? And in addition, what I think is so important and what we've been incredibly successful in doing is bringing people into the field who hadn't worked in melanoma before. Because so much, you want great minds, so it doesn't matter if they worked in other areas. If they're brilliant scientists and researchers, our goal is to fund them. And because it's so difficult to get funding when you're starting a lab, or even when you have a lab, people tend to go where the funding is. So we've been very lucky that people have wanted to work in melanoma, and one success breeds another. And now, because there have been 11 approved therapies, and we're very proud that we've funded all 11, we have put funds against each therapy. More and more people want to work in the field. Our original chief science officer was at Hopkins running the melanoma program. She said in immune therapy, maybe they'd get 100 people at ASCO. They had 10,000 last year when she presented and won an award. So again, the excitement and getting people who want to share their research, work together, not try to hinder their research, but very much encourage them to work with others in the field. Even when we do grants, we'll pay more if we can put two different proposals together, and both institutions will do better as a result. And more importantly, the patients will do better. And I just want to follow up with what Melissa said, because I really believe basic science, basic research is key. But for all the people suffering today, you want to also fund translational. I think they're both important, because you might get lucky and something can work, but you may not know why or who it works for. So the goal, I believe very strongly, is to fund and support both areas.
Diversify your portfolio.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to just highlight a few things that you said, because I think there are some common misconceptions out there. You know, when you were bringing those folks together, I think a lot of times people think, again, in the case of melanoma, like, oh, the dermatologist must talk to the oncologist. That is not the case. And that's the case, you know, it's the case now because of the Melanoma Research Alliance. But in other disease areas, when you think, oh, you know, this scientist must talk to that scientist, and the data scientists are involved. As a scientist myself, that is a huge misconception. And so I want to really, really stress the power of bringing those folks together. It's just as important as writing a check to whatever the project is. And I want to call your attention to a piece of collateral that's on your chairs that goes through some of these sorts of misconceptions to give you a little bit more perspective of the nuances around the challenges in the system. Now, Cindy, you know, you did a convening on kidney failure.
We did.
And can you tell us what was the impetus for that? And then also tell us, you got energized in a whole different way after your convening.
Certainly did.
And so can you tell us?
Not anticipated.
Tell us about that.
Rob, my husband, is also in the audience. His father suffers from end-stage renal disease. So he is on daily dialysis, and it's a tough disease. So, you know, the philanthropists, we wanted to see what we could do to help him. And we went to the Center for Strategic Philanthropy with nothing more than that mission. We would like to help, you know, my father-in-law, quality of life, see what's out there. So you convened a panel for us, over 40 experts that came together from every aspect of the disease. We had researchers, we had doctors that were working on artificial kidneys, we had the owner of the dialysis center, we had government officials. We, to their point, looked at that problem from every single aspect that you could look at it from. And it was like melanoma at the time, and unfortunately, the doctors were, and the panelists were so excited because not much. Kidney disease is not a sexy philanthropy, you know, medical issue out there. So we came to that meeting anticipating at the end of that meeting to be presented with, you know, this is what you should write your check for. This is the best way to move the needle. We were going to have done our work, move the needle, help his father. We were going to be done. What we found at that meeting was a very unusual, sort of different twist on how to do medical philanthropy. Everyone on that panel, one of the number one things that came back is that although 95% of people support organ donation, only 40 to 50%, depending where you are US-wide, are registered organ donors. And the number one issue, how we could move that needle the fastest, isn't the fantastic drug that's in basic or transitional science. It's not the artificial kidney. It's getting people off the wait list. It's getting more donors. So once again, what the CFP does very well is they said, let's take a look at your assets. And the woman working with the government said, this is a major platform of Obama's social. And if we could get just one thing on his agenda before he leaves office, December 15th, we had a very tangible deadline. We convened at the end of October. We get one thing approved on that deadline, and here's what it needs to be. It needs to be unique. Couldn't have been done before. It needs to show promise. One thing on that, doctor, we will be White House endorsed. We will be disseminated to hundreds of thousands of press. We can start to move this needle. So we looked at our assets, and what does Rob and I have beyond our checkbook, check writing, is we happen to be minority owners of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I'm also happy to share that we also have Larry, Kathleen, and Stephen Paul with us that are minority owners of the Pittsburgh Steelers. There is an asset we didn't utilize. We went to the Steelers and we asked, Pittsburgh, organ transplant capital of the world. The first transplant was performed there anyway 50 years ago. Dr. Thomas Starzl, we said we would like a football game in December to do an organ donation campaign. Fantastic. All we needed to do was to get on the books. We were in. You know, of course, the White House loved it. NFL, organ donation, month of December, heart, this works. So all of a sudden, instead of writing my check, I was thrust into developing with CSP, thank God, an organ donation awareness campaign. Well, then we went, and how can we leverage this even further? We have a relationship in Pittsburgh with the Pittsburgh Penguins. They came to us and they said, why the Steelers only? Why can't we be a part of this campaign? And we thought to ourselves, yes, nobody's ever done it. No one's done, you know, all three sports teams. Let's be the city of organ donor champions. Let's take a step back and plan a year-long campaign. Because one of the ways that organ donation registrations have failed in the past is they put a really sad ad in front of you or a really meaningful ad, and they ask you right then, make a decision. Go online, you know, register, re-register. And we decided that's kind of tough. But if we're going to hit you over the head through an entire season, entire year, maybe that last part at that Steeler game, you'll say, I've heard this all year, it's time to register. We can measure our metrics. We went back to the city of Pittsburgh and then we realized we've been donating in philanthropy for 25 years. I have bought a table at the sports banquet for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette for 25 years. So I said to them, what can you do for me? Well, Cindy, we do a speaker series. We will do a speaker series on transplantation. We will give you ad space, you know. And we went to utilize every other resource, and we're currently even in the process of developing this campaign that we will launch in June and take through December. And we want Pittsburgh to be the city of champions. We want to get that number from 40. We're currently in, you know, what metrics where we can get it to, but we want it up. And then we want to take this campaign and we want to take it to your city and to do it there. And it all came from, I just thought I was going to write a check.
A supercharged idea. So, you know, that's a really great example of how to think about your resources outside of just your dollars. And we call it the 4 T's. So your treasure, which are your dollars, your talent, your time, your ties. And so Cindy's using dollars, but also using her ties. You know, and this is something that we're seeing more and more from philanthropists. And so, you know, Melissa, I'd love if you could comment on this and also get other people's perspectives because, again, particularly with the time aspect, I know all of these women up here are very busy. So, you know, how do you think about it? But you all contribute your time. And so how do you balance that? So, Melissa, I'll start with you.
Yeah. So I think this is a great example of leveraging all of the 4 T's. And as you can see, sometimes the ties are even more valuable than the financials themselves. And Cindy obviously knows everybody in Pittsburgh, and she's not afraid to make the phone calls.
They do.
Yeah. And so this is something that we're seeing more broadly across the field of philanthropy, and that we're going to see more of, especially as millennials continue to be more engaged in philanthropy. And so there's been some research that's done looking at millennials, and they are really want hands-on engagement with the organizations that they are working with. And some of the research is saying if they're not able to do that, actually, they think that their giving is not only unsatisfying for them, but that it's ineffective and insufficient. And so I think with that as a backdrop, generally as a trend, we'll just need to think about, we'll probably go through some healthy growing pains as to how do these new donors and nonprofits work together in the most effective way. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to be a net positive for everyone.
Other thoughts? Absolutely.
Someone spoke to me the other day recommending
There's a mic coming.
recommending the commercialization of donors. In other words, if you paid for them, if people were allowed to pay for them, you could triple and quadruple the number of organs donated or available. And I heard the idea and it sounded like it made a lot of sense to me. I wonder what your thoughts on it are.
I think it just really opens up a real can of worms. As a matter of fact, one of the three main reasons why someone won't sign up to be an organ donor is that they believe that distribution of organs is not fair, that the rich do get organs and such. So I think, to be honest with you, in our pursuit, that opportunity to purchase organs is available in other places outside of the United States. And I just don't think it's a road that I'd like to go down this road first. I don't think it's not something that I could endorse. I think sometimes you get into that. Does the solution, what other problems would arise from it?
Mm-hmm. The other thing to highlight is that, and I didn't know this, so when I turned 16, my mother started talking to me about organ donation, and certainly when I went and got my license, she literally was like, so you're going to check that box, before I even knew what it really was, and it was the organ donation box. But what I didn't realize until we started this project is when the situation arises, and if I were to leave this earth tomorrow, that doesn't necessarily mean just because I check that box that they can take my organs and honor my wishes, because my family can step in and say, nope, this is not, I don't think this is what you would want. So, there are ways to get around that. There's a social media campaign. So if you tweet it, if you Facebook it, et cetera, to make your intentions known. So it's kind of a backup plan, if you will, to be able to, the family can point to and say, no, she really did want to do this. Like, she tweeted this out. It was on her Facebook page, et cetera. So I thought that was a really interesting thing and something that, I know it's not a lot of people are aware of. So if you all are organ donors, be aware of that.
There are a lot of live potential donors too. It's not only a death.
Absolutely.
Live donors. Well,
Absolutely.
that is very interesting in the study, even before we start paying for it. The donor is not reimbursed for work time and compensation, which is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, there's definitely things that can be done there. So unfortunately, a lot of people who would like to donate can't, because they just can't afford to be off. So there's, I think those are some of the steps to take before. And then also for donation too, there's, what in France, and they're proposing legislation in Texas now, you actually have to opt out rather than opt in, which is also another really interesting. So there's a lot of steps, and we plan to make this all a part of our campaign, this awareness. But there is definitely a major living donor campaign too, and there's a lot of work to be done there.
Yeah.
Even just getting us better in sync of connecting donors. Donor chains have become very popular.
Right.
And showing the efficacy of that.
So really taking a multi-pronged approach, if you will, to address a problem. Okay, I guess we're starting Q&A. It's okay. Let's do it.
There was mention of a venture fund. I think it was for breast cancer.
Yep.
So we've been looking at 501c3 disease-specific venture funds.
Please help.
Well, my question is, what kind of reaction are you getting, if any?
So we've spent a lot of time trying to develop the vehicle, which has been really difficult. So what we've found so far is that we're starting within our donor base, who has been waiting to see that. So
That's a tough way to go.
I know. I want help. I mean, we really do. But and you know what? Here's an example of being too effective of what we've been doing, because our fundraising has, been successful. We're raising $60 million a year that we're distributing. So there is a part within our board that's very nervous, about cannibalizing that. So it's, and to your point, and I think this we talk about how a philanthropist, Rob and I, we've sort of taken the charge on this and saying we're willing to put some risk out there. So, but, so.
Because you're just seeing this tremendous need on the part of these foundations, whether it's MRIs or PRIs. Ford just said we're going to put $1 billion. Heron just said we're all MRI focused. Those are the players. It's not it's not the individuals. It's the institutional investor. That's our feeling.
We went back and forth. I would love to continue this conversation because we really spent a lot of time going back and forth on that, and we were very concerned about the conflict.
Melissa, did you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add. I think after the success of the cystic fibrosis story, after that, I'm sure almost every
the holy grail.
Every board had a phone call. Let's come together and talk about, should we do this too? How can we do this? And I want to say it was a lightning strike, but in some respects it was. That's not going to be. Not everyone's going to be able to replicate that. But I think it's good to have the conversation.
That was a lottery ticket. That was a lottery ticket as opposed to a venture fund, which spreads the risk and spreads the opportunity.
Right. And so I think there are some interesting models that are percolating out there about how do we, there are some organizations that are starting their own venture fund, or how do we start venture funds where we're just using philanthropy as one tranche of capital, where we're just de-risking and making it more attractive for the institutional investors to come into the
We definitely were working on that,
space.
the phase 2 development of it, but I think, just speaking personally for the BCRF board, we felt more comfortable starting with a pilot to sort of get some studies under our belt with our donors.
I think
Please.
I'm familiar with a little bit. I'm Rob Citrone, Cindy's husband.
You handle the business part of it.
That's his official title, Cindy's husband.
I know
You
the
didn't
Cindy's
know.
husband, that's for sure. Certainly in Pittsburgh I am. The interesting thing is that they have some of the best cancer doctors in the world affiliated with them, and they really do know of the research that they've funded over the last 10 years. They really do know which 10 or 15 are the most promising. It's amazing. It's self-selection. It's incredible. It is a great investment opportunity. They're just struggling with it should be a nonprofit thing, should be a for-profit. How are we going to do this? And I think they're getting caught up in a lot of the details. And there's it's a very complex thing. And you don't want to step out there and then fail. So I think that's the other aspect. So it's still in the development phase. It still hasn't been actually launched. The board hasn't approved it yet. But I can tell you that the fact that they have an incredible amount of knowledge and information that you just can't replicate. So there's something there. They just got to figure out how to get it out.
Another question?
So I have a question that's perhaps a little bit of a change of theme here, and it pertains specifically to medical devices and medical device research. It seems that the large medical device manufacturers, certainly in the Western world now, they are so averse to risk that their idea of growth is acquisition of other device manufacturers that already have an established sales base and user base. And this makes getting new devices and novel devices through the valley of death from the benchtop to a point where some type of spin out or startup can even get VC to go out there and try and develop a user base extremely challenging. And I guess I'd like to hear from you and anybody else in the room about perhaps novel ways to get more philanthropic dollars into getting devices through that valley of death.
So I can maybe start to take this, but I'm probably not coming at this from a device specific, but just sort of generally thinking about how do we get novel therapies through through translational valley death. And I think there's a lot of different models, and this sort of piggybacks off to the last question. What are the financial mechanisms that we need to do that? So are there venture funds, or is there investing directly in other companies? And these are the role of a nonprofit. Partnering with other companies to actually go out and source and find therapies that could be then input into a pharma pipeline. So Leukemia and Lymphoma Society has a really interesting program that does that, and they can partner with large biotech and pharma and go actually scout for molecules that meet their requirements and get them get commitment to get those into the pipeline and into a commercialization process. I think there's some other really interesting models out there. There's one being driven by philanthropically called the Harrington, again, this is a drug discovery institute platform, but really looking at all these different segments, finding translational ready projects, funding them in academia, and then connecting them to a set of experts and mentors and additional capital that can get them through translational and then go into a for-profit but mission-aligned accelerator that again helps them get them into pharma. So I think there's a number of different models that are out there that nonprofits and foundations are experimenting that are both bringing the financial capital to the space, but also the understanding of what it actually means to translate and what are the pharma partners ultimately looking for at the end of the day, so they can make sure they're creating the right data and they're de-risking it in a way that it's going to be of interest and attractive to move into a pipeline. So I think there's a lot of different models that are percolating out there right now, but not specific to device, so sorry about that.
All right. Any other questions?
Thank you for sharing your stories. I had a specific question about the point that you raised earlier about the need to do some M&A in the world of philanthropy, and I just wanted to explore this a bit more because it's something I'm very interested in.
So we just had a conversation about this morning. So in the United States, there's about 1.5 million nonprofits. About 600,000 of them have revenues that are less than $1 million, and so there's lots and lots of nonprofits out there. And you have to wonder, are they all being effective with those tiny budgets? And they all have leadership and overhead. So are they all being effective? Are they being duplicative? And so I think we're starting to have that conversation around how do we drive efficiencies into that? Are there sort of forcing functions where we can bring folks together and really have some conversations around what can we be doing together, either formally in bringing organizations together or at least being coordinated. So come together, map out the system, and then say, you know what, I'm taking this slice, you're taking that slice, and let's just get a little bit more coordinated so we have some efficiency. And then I think there's some other structural things around sharing back office and that sort of thing that can be done. But I think that's definitely sort of a growing issue, and that we need to have a more critical eye to how efficient are all these organizations? What are the metrics that we need to, and standards that we need to hold them to? And if they're not, how do we create some more efficiencies?
There's one thing I would add on to what you're saying. I think there are way too many foundations, but that said, a lot of the, especially the very small ones with less than $1 million in revenue, are often in honor of a lost person, someone you loved, a family member, a friend who died of a specific disease, and they want to honor their memory. And unfortunately, it becomes very difficult to maintain and run these foundations, especially if you have no professionals. And one of the things we've been pretty successful with at the Melanoma Research Alliance is appreciating and understanding how important it is to many of these families and friends of people to honor their lost person, and they don't want to change the name. where we've been effective and I think successful for these small organizations and for funding melanoma research is saying, listen, we fund every year 10, 12, it depends how much. And this year we had over 200 proposals that were vetted, and so at the end I think we funded 35 of them. What we were able to do though is honor the family members, because they do have some money, they do a couple of fundraisers, but in the past it was never money that could be effective. So here we have 33 funded, vetted proposals, all expenses administrative in our organization are covered by Leanne and myself. So that way they know every penny of the hard-earned, and it is hard-earned money they've raised, goes directly to science, to fund research in honor of the person they've lost. And I think many of these small foundations have been so appreciative and grateful that they are respected and honored because they started these organizations because of someone they cared about. And I think a lot of foundations are insensitive to the fact that it's very important to people to honor somebody. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to figure out a strategic way to work with people, but also appreciate what, sometimes we don't listen to what they want and why they want it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Deborah, and also just to piggyback on your piggyback, how can we leverage some of the great due diligence inside of foundations and democratize that? And so if they're, maybe they can be a little bit more leaner, but still have a presence and a name and an honor, but using somebody else's due diligence.
Yeah, but to the bigger point, I think your question is, I do think that we definitely need merger and acquisition among the larger organizations.
Competing larger
as well.
Often.
And there was some discussion around this morning, and the hope is that as donors, as philanthropists, become more strategic and more metrics are developed, and you can start to evaluate foundations better. Perhaps some of this selection will happen, because currently the resources aren't there. We have things like, how do you evaluate a charity? 91 cents on every dollar goes. Those figures drive me crazy. I mean, absolutely crazy, because so as we, and there's some talk about philanthropists, Milken, uniting, collaborating to come up with standards, to come up with evaluations. And especially as we talk about the millennials, the next generation, I think we even invest differently than our parents did. We talk about the number of charities, what you said it was 1.8 billion. I mean, it was a crazy number. When I grew up, you gave to your church, your university, and your hospital. So some of this selective process, I think, will start to happen, but there's definite ways that we can by educating philanthropists. And I also just did want to clarify and thank Rob for bringing up to the point with the BCRF. We are making the commitment to do some sort of commitment, but we haven't committed to our device yet. I don't want to speak out of turn saying, but that's probably the direction. But but seeing this as a way in the future. But I think some of that'll help.
Thank you. You're all really very inspiring. I wanted to just ask your opinion on something a little bit more of the basic building blocks of a disease foundation, and that is first a patient registry. Getting to know the patients, getting to know when they're diagnosed, perhaps even getting a biospecimen. And then second, it's establishing care center networks where you can begin to develop standards of care among people who are doing the best and the brightest research. And then finally, establishing a therapeutics network where you could assist companies in the construction of clinical trials, which is enormously expensive in drug development. Just try to get your thoughts on those those items. Thanks.
Yes to all three?
Yeah, I would say I think those are, when we think about where to put philanthropic capital, yes, we need to close the scientific unknowns, but we need to think about the system as well. So we think about science and system, and those are systems issues. So in addition to some of the tools and infrastructure that you mentioned, I think are critically important and they're the important but not necessarily sexy things to invest in, but they can be incredibly useful in helping to better understand the trajectory of the disease, the natural history of the disease, of having patients all in one spot that you can mobilize very quickly when there is an experimental therapy to go into a clinic. If pharma sees that your space has that's going to be more attractive for them to get involved as well. So I think you're absolutely thinking about those correctly as building blocks.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add, particularly to the patient registry piece, that it's important to engage those patients. So don't just ask them to sign up for your registry and then send them a letter in the mail when there's a trial coming up. Figure out a way to engage your patients over time so that they continue to populate the registry, interact with the registry, learn from the registry, because otherwise it becomes this wasteland that kind of, if anything, sometimes annoys the patients from some of the things that we've heard.
Yeah, and looking at the value of the data and the processing of it. I know at the PCRF we've just added researchers for biostatistics. We've expanded that. Even personally in our foundation, we're working with Columbia's public health, working biostatistics, because a lot of the answers are going to come. I used to, my son is actually getting his degree in advanced statistics, his master's, and I used to think he was going to be a doctor and cure cancer. But now I'm thinking maybe as a statistician he may cure cancer.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I think we have to leave it there. The session is over, but I want to thank the audience first because you all were outstanding. And thank our panelists, our game-changing women. And I think this is true. If it's not true, it's going to stay true in my head, but this is the only panel of women that you will see at Global
Best
Conference.
looking.
So